It's a funny place to be, stuck in a seemingly mundane world with an inner knowing that the universe is so much more than our mortal minds can comprehend. Yet we all have the capacity to know peace and our oneness with the wholeness of life. And through these interviews, discussions, and reflections, it is my intention to share this possibility. I'm Ryan Kurzak, and this is the Kriya Yoga podcast. Okay, so welcome everyone back to the Kriya Yoga podcast. I'm here with another very special guest, Marty Wuttke, who is also a minister of Center for Spiritual Awareness and a student of Roy Eugene Davis. And Marty is the founder and CEO of the Wuttke Institute of Neurotherapy. So thank you for being with me today, Marty.
My pleasure.
So there's so much that I would love to talk to you about. And to get into it, my first question would be, what is it that you do? Tell me a little bit about your work and what you're up to and how you got into that.
Okay. Well, it's a long story. We have to rewind the clock time here to give a little bit of a foundation.
Yes.
So while I was living at Center for Spiritual Awareness back in the early 80s, studying meditation, doing my sadhana, and so on, I got the idea with Roy's support to go to a local hospital to see what they were doing with drug and alcohol treatment because I was interested in that. And I checked out the hospital and I started initially by volunteering there to teach meditation. And what happened rather quickly was the meditation started to produce some significant results with the patients that were there in the hospital. Generally, they were there for about a month stay. So the medical director there in the hospital was impressed, and he actually knew of Roy, and they asked me if I would consider coming on the staff of the hospital to take the meditation and make it a part of their treatment program. So I did, and within several weeks, I did realize that these people were, some of them had significant issues from depression to post-traumatic stress syndrome, along with their drug and alcohol addiction. In fact, that was often the reason for their drug and alcohol addiction, eating disorders, head injuries, and so on. So I realized that I needed a way to, I hate to say speed up the meditation learning process, but in effect, that's what I needed. And I talked to Roy about it, and he told me to go to, look at some of the research and visit the Himalayan Institute because he knew they did biofeedback there. It was up at that time in Holmesdale, Pennsylvania. Mm-hmm. Had some very good physicians there. So biofeedback then was simply a way to help people learn how to get in touch with their bodies and then to shift physiologic mechanisms so that the meditation process could unfold a little easier. Very quickly, though, my research showed me that the key to what happens in meditation in terms of the physiology of the body appears to be changes that occur in the brain, and in particular, brain waves. And brain waves are those electrical signals that our brains give off. If you were to hook yourself up to a light bulb, your brain basically gives off enough electricity to light up a 40-watt light bulb. So I became fascinated by that, and there was a bit of research, not that much back in the early 80s about it. Most of it was done by transcendental meditation. But there were a couple of other very interesting research studies as well. So there was something, a type of biofeedback, a specialty called brainwave biofeedback or neurofeedback. And I immediately was attracted to that. Talked to Roy about the efficacy, and he supported me 100% to give it a try. So brainwave biofeedback was a way to, I found was a way to show people what their brains are doing so that they can begin to change them in the direction of more quiet, more calmness, mental chatter going down, and so on. Because many people inadvertently, when they meditate, at least I found back then in this particular population, many people inadvertently, when they try to meditate, there's actually patterns in the brain that keep supporting their trauma, a lot of resistance patterns. So my job was to begin to help people to see those patterns and to change them. You can actually change what the electrical activity in your brain is up to if you're given the appropriate feedback. So I started doing that in the hospital. We got very significant results right away. And neurofeedback caught on like wildfire around the world very quickly. And now, I mean, it's everywhere you look, you can find a neurofeedback practitioner practicing. Neurofeedback is different depending on the practitioner you go to, which is one of the little drawbacks right now. There's several schools of thought. But in essence, what I do now is neurotherapy. And although most neurofeedback you see out there when you look up practitioners is geared towards different problems and disorders, like, for instance, attention deficit disorder, post-traumatic stress disorder, addiction, depression, anxiety disorders, and so on. So most neurofeedback is geared toward this. But what I'm trying to do is sort of going back to my roots and the beginning, where I was doing neurofeedback primarily to help people get into the meditative states.
Right.
And, that's always been my agenda with what I do. But, I get people coming to me for all kinds of issues and problems because my expertise is on the brain. But I'm always trying to guide people back towards the meditation model. So I have a clinic out here in Northern California, Central Coast, Santa Barbara, California. Also may open something back up in Atlanta because that's, I was there for quite a while too. But I do research now. My wife Stella is a neuroscientist and a cognitive psychologist, and happens to be a Kriya Yogi as well.
Right.
From Austria. So we're working on a book. And again, this was with Roy's blessing. People are very much into technology nowadays. We know that.
Right.
So trying to assist meditators, there's, as we all know, those of us at least who study yoga, there's no instant way to enlightenment. There's not going to be a drug. There's not a technique. There's nothing. It's a matter of grace and, a person's intensity.
Right.
But there are these tools that we have available now that we can help that process move along, and it's quite fascinating to watch people go through this. So I treat all ages, people from all walks of life, and so on and so on. But essentially, as I said a minute ago, Ryan, my goal is to get back to this more meditative spiritual model and make that my primary emphasis now.
Right. Okay. So when you said you first got involved in all of this, you were going to a hospital. I'm assuming that was around the Clayton area where CSA was.
Yeah, just 7 miles from CSA, there was a very plush, 2 hospitals actually, Woodridge Hospital and Ridgecrest Hospital. Woodridge was it was like a resort, kind of tucked away there in the mountains. And a few of the CSA people worked there in different capacities. So I felt kind of at home. As I said, the medical director knew Roy. It was a profound coincidence, to be quite honest.
Right. Well, let's rewind a little bit further then, sure. Because we definitely are going to talk about the work you do and how it relates to Kriya Yoga and meditation in general. But many of the people who are listening, they are either just learning about Kriya Yoga or are on the path themselves. And I always find it interesting how people find Kriya Yoga and what drew them to Kriya Yoga. So what was your introduction to Kriya Yoga, and how did you come to accept it as a valid way for awakening and clarifying your consciousness?
Sure. I think my story is similar to many people's stories that we hear, and primarily I was born in New York and always had a very strong philosophical and spiritual attraction. raised in the Roman Catholic Church, but never quite bought into the stuff there. And some of the interesting things occurred in my life that we hear about. I very early on saw a book on Hatha Yoga and immediately was very impressed with myself because I could do lotus posture and went around telling everybody I knew how to do yogurt. So my mother told me that years ago. So, that went through the typical childhood, very shy and introverted, but and then being from New York in the early 70s, unfortunately fell into some of the adolescent misbehaviors that some of us do and got into, running with the wrong crowd and drugs and alcohol and all that stuff. And then finally made my way through that and started to have some glimpses of spiritual experiences that were just sort of coming out of nowhere. Mm-hmm. And by the time I was in my early 20s, I realized that, it's all about finding a spiritual path and jumping on that spiritual path with both feet. So I was sort of led to attend Life Chiropractic University in Georgia. And sure enough, one of my classmates had lived at CSA before he became a student at Life Chiropractic University. And I was at his apartment one day, and there on his mantelpiece was that beautiful picture of Paramahansa Yogananda, where he has the garland of flowers around his neck and he's sort of effulgent. Mm-hmm. And I saw it, and I said, I don't know if I saw it before that, but I said, that's an incarnation of love. And he was like, whoa. And he said, well, guess what? Roy Eugene Davis is going to be here this weekend. I think you should come meet him. And I was like, well, who's Roy Eugene Davis? But, he was lecturing at a religious science church in Atlanta. And, this is one of those experiences that stand out strongly in my mind. I believe this was 1982. And I knew, the second I saw him, I knew that was my guru. And Jerry, this was Jerry Brusack, by the way. Mm-hmm. He passed away earlier this year. Right. A wonderful fellow, chiropractor. And he introduced me to Roy. And Roy tapped me on, I'll never forget, tapped me on the back 3 times and said, come up and see me. And I took that as okay, I'll do it. So for about a year, every Sunday I went up and just meditated there at CSA with Roy, if he was there or if he was not there. And I would just drive up from Atlanta, where I lived in Marietta, about a 1.5, 2-hour drive, meditate for half an hour and drive back. Roy saw that I was very committed and very intense on what I was doing. I was unhappy with the direction my life was going in, though I didn't feel like chiropractic was where I was supposed to be. So the long and short of it was he asked me if I wanted to live and work there at CSA because I was in this transition phase. So I did, and that's how I got there. And then just did the sadhana there at the center and got to see Roy daily, and I was his official driver back and forth to the airport. Travel, which he did quite a bit then. Right. So I really was able to absorb lots and lots and lots and lots and lots of information, wonderful stories, and most of it we've all heard in his talks, but every time you hear it, it sounds like it's the first time.
Right.
So that, and then that was what sort of started the whole process off.
Well, so okay, so I follow what you're doing here, and I'm trying to imagine back in the 80s and this idea of neurofeedback, and I've been playing around with M waves and the Muse and all these sorts of things. What did you have available to you to be able to study these things?
There was some nice equipment that was invented by a fellow in New York, Adam Crane, who was long gone. But he developed some very nice 5-channel EEG equipment and some very decent software where you could do pretty much any kind of training you wanted to, from alpha training to something called synchrony training, alpha theta training, beta training. And see what I found very early on is that although we'd like for this not to be true, there's really no one-size-fits-all model in regard to training the brain to reach meditative states. You have to see where a person is starting from.
Right.
Like everybody who meditates, is going to have different inclinations toward different styles or techniques of meditation. So you have to see where a person is starting from, what their brain is actually doing, and then you can sort of create a hierarchy of first we need to, and it's like the eight steps. First you may have to learn how to relax, then you may have to learn how to concentrate, then you may have to learn how to do sensory withdrawal. All of those are neurophysiologic changes that have to occur in the brain. This is what Yogananda referred to in a statement he made that was highlighted in that documentary movie Awake, where he says the spine and the brain are the altar of God. Well, he was being quite literal there, that a transformation has to occur, and it is neurological transformation. And Kriya Yoga just happens to be one of the faster routes to that process. Right. And I tried to map that out. Well, how does that work? What does it mean? What's the brain doing? What's the changes that occur? So as technology improves and we become more sophisticated, we see that there are neurophysiologic changes that the brain and the nervous system of the meditator goes through that all build. One's a foundation, then one builds on top of that, and so on and so on and so on. And yes, it's true. You've got to have a very strong foundation before you can move on to some higher levels. So
right. And so by these foundations, you referenced the 8 limbs of yoga, with asana, for example, being able to sit still, and then the pranayama, circulating or maybe helping oneself relax, and then internalizing attention, then concentrating. These are all things that have like reference points with what you study. Okay.
Yeah. One thing I stress, because many people on the spiritual path run into this, is there's a part of the brain we call the limbic system, and it's not a part of the brain, it's actually a system and a series of connections. But the limbic system is, if you want to look at the brain this way, it's more of the primitive fight, flight, or flee responses and so on. Mm-hmm. And it regulates the autonomic nervous system, which has the sympathetic, parasympathetic, so the gas pedal and the brakes of the nervous system. These parts of the brain have to be settled down. You could even think of them as associated with lower chakra, survival, instinct, territoriality, mm-hmm. and all of those, what we call these lower chakra things. So those parts of the brain, what we find is that it's important for them to be regulated. And things like asanas and pranayamas and certain meditation techniques are really integral to getting the body and the nervous system to calm and quiet. And if you don't, you run the risk of moving too quickly. And, that's sort of the risk in people wanting to take microdoses of LSD or ayahuasca to experience higher states of consciousness. Right. The nervous system's not ready for it. And you can get into all kinds of problems with that sort of thing. So and I've often said this in presentations that I've given, that the science of yoga, the rishis and sages and yogis who investigated these methods and techniques, they were the true neurophysiologists. Mm-hmm. They were the ones who saw, we don't have fancy technology and fancy equipment, but guess what? When you breathe this way, when you do this posture, when you practice this particular meditation technique, guess what? It's changing your brain.
Right. Well, that brings me to another question. When I was at CSA a few weeks ago, leading this retreat, and one of the participants asked me, because I was speaking from Roy's book, The Science of Self-Realization, she said, okay, well, I see it says the science of self-realization. She wanted me to describe to her, how is it that it's a science? And she was asking because I think she's from Sweden. And she said, when she brings that up, people are going to ask her, okay, well, yes, you say it's a science. Well, what does that mean? And my response was, well, that it's a repeatable process. But my question to you would be, based on what you've learned, you being a practitioner, you having all this access to scientific technology to study these things, how would you say Kriya Yoga is a science? How would you answer that question?
I think your response was perfect. Number one, it's a repeatable process. But number two, and we're still working on this, to confirm and verify the changes that are occurring in the nervous system, whether you see thickening in the frontal lobes, or you see these changes in MRIs or brainwave patterns, and then correlating that with the changes in the individual, I think that's the science of it. And even, when I started all this some 35 years ago, I mentioned the TM Transcendental Meditation Studies. Well, I also happened to find a study from the mid-50s from France by a researcher by the name of Gestaut, Gastaut, and they identified some significant EEG changes in a certain population of meditators, and it just so happened that they were Kriya Yogis. So and then all this information a few years ago came out from Richard Davidson, who did some research on the Dalai Lama's advanced Tibetan meditators, and they saw the same thing. And it's higher frequency brainwave activity. And then sure enough, as I've measured some Kriya Yogis, I see the same thing. So, that's confirmation, and that is science.
Right.
We can see these things that occur in the brain. It's a confirmation. And, and also, it is objective information that we can take. And maybe right now it's hypothetical, but in the future, I'm sure we'll be able to show more clearly what's going on.
Right. And so with what you've been doing, because that was another interest of mine, have you been able to study, create people who are doing Kriya Yoga meditation specifically?
Yes.
And what has that, has it given the same results as other types of meditation, or what have you found? What have you seen with that?
No, I think, if you can visualize the brain and the higher, more evolved areas of the brain, the higher brain cortex. What we see with Kriya Yogis is this cortical excitation. So it's almost like a magnification of energy, and this corresponds to the brain waves that I just mentioned in these other studies called gamma. And gamma is to say it's around 40 hertz, but it's really a broader range of activity than that. But when you see gamma, it's indicative of what we call a binding activity. So it's considered a binding frequency, where you see the whole brain sort of coming together. And like whenever you have an aha moment or a realization, or you recognize somebody, or you learn something, there's usually a burst of gamma activity along with other frequencies. But the gamma appears to be pulling things together. But I think with Kriya Yoga and particularly the Kriya Yoga pranayama, the main basic technique, it seems to be a true activator of the cortex. And as far as I can tell over time, doing the practice of it regularly, it is indicative of increasing this communication in the cortex. And, another way you could also look at it is a gamma. You see a lot of gamma, that person's brain and their consciousness is very present. It's not basing information on past data. It's basing information on what is occurring now. So it is, again, I think it has a lot to do with the style of technique we practice, which of course is based on Kriya. But also, as Roy always said, this is attentive. This isn't daydreaming. This isn't trying to space out. This isn't trying to, go off into some other realm. This is very attentive and focused meditation, and I think that's the difference, or at least helps produce some of the difference we see in Kriya Yoga.
Right. And so that focus then, because that was one of my other questions, I think you answered it, but the focus then was on doing the actual Kriya pranayama and kind of paying attention to the circulation within the spine.
Right.
And when you have witnessed these things, is it when they are actually doing that process, or is it after they've completed it and they're maybe sitting there in the silence, or is it both?
Yeah, it's after.
Okay.
It's a generalized change. The brain changes, and it is like, okay. So Richie Davidson's research on the Tibetan meditators was very straightforward. Their brains are different all the time, and like their gamma is 2 or 3-fold the normal. So they're living in a particular state. Roy's EEG was that way too. I was, very pleasantly surprised to see that. In fact, I'll never forget, I did his EEG once, and then just to test it out, I sent it off to another clinician who is very familiar with these patterns, and she emailed me back, not knowing who he was or anything at all, and said, "This person's in universal consciousness." Wow.
Yeah.
So it was very, very, very nice confirmation.
How does, with what you have access to, and I think many years ago I might have actually emailed you asking you this question, the things that are available to people on the market. I mentioned the M-Wave, which I know isn't neurofeedback, and then the Muse headband, and there was another one that seems to be quite a bit more complicated, that you have to like wet the sensors and put it on your head. Are there anything that's available to people that they can just buy without spending $20,000 to $30,000 on some kind of fantastic device?
I think that the closest thing, Ryan, because I look at this almost every day, looking at home equipment. But you mentioned it as the Muse. But my only issue with the Muse is that what you're training, in other words, when you put that on, they say, okay, make the birdies sing.
Right.
You'll be meditating. Well, they will not divulge, because it's proprietary, what are you changing in your brain that's making those birdies sing?
Right.
Because whatever the frequencies are that you're actually training might be good for one person, but not so good for another person. But the Muse has partnered with another company in Tel Aviv that we're working with now, where you can individualize the protocol. So in other words, you can say, well, maybe this one isn't so good for you. We can alter the feedback signal so that you get this one.
Right.
And, for the price, it's a decent piece of equipment. And as long as we can somewhat individualize it, in my opinion, it's the best one on the market now. There's like 10 big companies, well, not 10, but somewhere between 5 and 10 big companies that are really working on this. Everybody wants to break through this meditation model and provide a home headset that can do this sort of thing. And people are looking at individualizing it. So I think over the next year or two, you're going to see a lot of stuff popping up on the market. I know a lot of software people and hardware people out here, and there's quite a bit happening. Lots of money in it too. So.
Well, here's a quick question about the Muse that maybe you can answer, because this is what I noticed about it. I noticed that it has this, you put it on first, and then it kind of takes an idea of what's going on in your head, and you go through the process, and it, as you mentioned, lets little birdies sing or gives you the readout afterwards. But what it seemed to me is that it was always starting at a new baseline. Like it never seemed, for example, if I had been meditating for a year and I put it on day 366, well, now it's measuring my baseline from where I am now versus where I had been a year ago. And I guess that's useful, but it seems like it would be a little more useful if we could actually see progress. Do you understand what I'm trying to describe?
No, I do. And you're right. That's exactly what it's doing. It does a baseline every time you put it on your head.
So how do you, how does one use it then to get a sense of, I'm doing it better now. if you just constantly have to do that.
Yeah, that's the challenge. And there's two pieces to that. One, yeah, when a client comes in, I will do a quantitative EEG, which is a brain map, so I see everything their brain is doing. 5,600 metrics are measured. And then I go back to that after they're done going through the treatment or training process and say, oh, look, this shifted, this shifted, this shifted. So that is something obviously the Muse is not capable of doing. There's just one electrode in there versus when you do a brain map, which has 19 electrodes.
Right.
The other thing too, and this is kind of hard for some of us to wrap our minds around, lots of the changes you see in a person's brain are non-linear.
Okay.
And that, we all want to say, well, I want to see myself go from a score of 6 to 7 to 8 to 9 to 10. Then I know I'm doing better. Well, guess what? It doesn't always work that way. And largely it's because the brain is such this enormously complex electrical system. So sometimes you just have to hang out in a space for a long enough time and then get some kind of subjective measure. Like, am I doing better, or am I just, this is wishful thinking, am I more focused? Am I intent on my spiritual path? Are my behaviors more in line with what my intentions are? So that, frankly, is the more important measure than anything you're going to see in the EEG.
Right.
But we're especially Americans. Oh my gosh, we're very linear, and I want to go from 0 to 10 as quick as possible. So.
Right. Well, that leads me to my next question, which I didn't actually send you; it just came to me, so I apologize. But the question is, when it comes to meditative states in the brain, when I'd first gotten the Muse and I was playing around with it a little bit, I'd been meditating for a decent amount of time, and I had gone through a period of time where I wasn't getting much sleep, and it was a very difficult time period. And I thought, well, I'm still meditating just fine. And then I popped the Muse on, and I looked at the readout afterwards, and it was all over the map. And so I started thinking to myself, well, sure, I definitely need more sleep, definitely need to be taking care of myself better. But it led me to this question, and that is, I understand that the brain is a reflection of, in a sense, what our physical state of consciousness is, but is there possibilities of a person experiencing, say, clearer states of consciousness or clarity of awareness or universal consciousness while their brain is then not necessarily showing that? Like, could they be engaged in something to where their brain has to act a certain way, but yet they are still within a state of clarity and that universal consciousness as you described? Does this question make sense?
Absolutely. And I'll give you two answers to that. The first answer is no. Your brain, it's like a mirror. And, and a lot of people have difficulty with this concept of, well, your mind is not, we have different ideas about the mind and the brain, and where is the mind, so to speak. Mm-hmm. The brain is definitely the organ of the mind. So what we think on a second to second, even fraction of a second basis, is going to reflect in the brain.
Right.
These thoughts are electrical in nature. They're between neurons. So if there are shifts in states of consciousness, well, guess what? You have to see it in the brain. However, when you reach, and some of this we just have to guess at unless we're in these states. When you are like, when you're God realized, you're in the background. Your consciousness is identified with witnessing, not attached.
Right.
And however, when I have mentioned people who have achieved that state, you still see it in the brain. You see this gamma activity that is probably a reflection of that. So
okay.
I don't think we can separate the two out as the short answer to the question.
Okay. Well, then let's say, for example, let's say we're dealing with an individual who often accesses this universal state of consciousness, and then we see them interacting with the world where they're like Yogananda. I forget. I heard Mr. Davis say one time. He said, "I'm not an angry person. I just have a fiery personality." Right.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So if let's just say Yogananda was in the middle of a situation and had to act fiery to get his point across, would we see any part of the brain, related to something like anger, or would it still in your mind kind of reflect that gamma state consistently?
Probably both. And the anger may not be anger; it may just be activation of a certain area.
Right.
The temporal lobes, above your ears, there tend to be associated with emotional output. There's a very cool YouTube on as well. I can't remember the name of it. It's on mindfulness meditation, and they did some research on a very a real prodigy mindful fellow, and they looked at the part of his brain associated with compassion, and the way the researchers described it is that part of his brain is almost in a permanent seizure. Because it's so strong.
Wow.
So, and that's all that particular style of meditation is compassion meditation.
Right.
So it's these areas of our brain are not producing this activity. They're just like, transmission towers, more or less.
Right. Okay. So I'm going to take it just a little bit further, and I know we're reaching into speculative territory here. But I've had interest in people who've had near-death experiences and these sorts of things. Mm-hmm. I'm assuming that if they are being truthful and accurate, then if they're having an experience and they still have a sense of mind, yet maybe are considered to be maybe clinically brain dead, where does that fit into all of this? Or is that even something we should be talking about right now?
I think there's way too much theory and speculation about this. Raymond Moody, the fellow who actually came up with the term near-death experiences, he's kind of the one who has popularized this the most. But he was here in Santa Barbara a couple of years ago, and I went to meet him. And he talked about the shared crossing experiences, because one of the arguments about these near-death experiences, it's just brain chemistry changes and you're just hallucinating and so on and so on and so on. But what Moody found was that there was a lot of reports from people, doctors and nurses and loved ones and so on, who were in the same room as the dying people. And when they cross over, what they say they cross over, they would have glimpses of what those people were experiencing. Mm-hmm. Of course, those people would come back and, so who knows? So right. I'm sort of on the fence about a lot of this, but it's very interesting to look at. And where is this? What's really happening here? I think we just don't have enough information yet.
Right. Okay. Well, then, I really would like to share with people some things that could be helpful for them based on, I guess, what you might call neuro hacks. So, for example, in certain texts, it's recommended that when one is meditating, that by gently lifting the eyebrows, that helps one deepen the experience, or even smiling. Or do you have any insights into things like this and how it helps people meditate better?
Absolutely. When you, this was discovered many years ago by Barbara Brown. She wrote a book, big book on biofeedback. And so when you're meditating, your eyes are closed, and you say raise your eyebrows, but what you're also doing is gently rolling your eyes up. Mm-hmm. You do that, you get a big burst of alpha activity in the back of the brain. It just happens to correlate. So, everything we do, every thought we think, every engagement that we have with another person has some kind of correlate in the brain and nervous system. That's why we have to be careful.
Right.
But so when you meditate, and Roy would always say, gently roll your eyes up, and if you want, you can imagine you're looking out into the distance through the center of your forehead. Steady gazing contributes to steady concentration. If your eyes float down, you tend to go into, or at least get closer to the possibility of falling into subconscious states. And we found that that's very true. So, those little keys that we've we've gotten certainly are verifiable breath awareness. Being aware of the flow of the breath in and out of the nostrils, feeling the cool as we inhale, the warmth as we exhale. These things are triggering specific parts of the brain, and in particular the Kriya Yoga pranayama. There are nerves in the back of the throat that correspond to different brain regions. I won't get too technical here, but there's no doubt that it's helping to access different areas of the brain. And what I like to think about it, a lot of it is helping us access the brain stem and the medulla, which in yoga is called the mouth of God. So it's like we're going back to the source of this life force with some of these techniques, which is what the whole intention of them happens to be anyway.
Right. And with the Kriya Pranayama, you mentioned the nerves in the back of the throat. Then in Kriya Pranayama, it's recommended, at least in the beginning, to breathe a certain way with the mouth open. But in time, it's okay to breathe with the mouth shut. So are you saying, or would it be better if people kept the mouth open practice? Or does it matter as long as you're just constricting the throat when you do the breathing?
Right. It doesn't matter as long as you're getting that sensation at the back of the throat. And usually in the beginning, you need your mouth open so you really feel it.
Right. Okay. What about alternate nostril breathing? Have you seen anything with that seems to be particularly helpful?
Yeah, it appears. I haven't, there's been some research on it. So some of this is hypothetical, but it would appear that it helps balance the left and right hemispheres of the brain, and also the autonomic nervous system, because one side is the Ida and the other side the Pingala. And so we say that's masculine and feminine, but it's also sympathetic and parasympathetic respectively. So you do, and then of course there's certain techniques where you focus more on one side than the other, and you'll find, oh, that's very calming, or oh, that's more invigorating.
Right.
Well, it really has to do with that, with these two portions of the nervous system. So I think alternate nostril breathing is, and personally, I think it's an essential preparatory technique when you first start meditating, because it rapidly starts to balance the autonomics. And as I said, 30 minutes ago, that is a key to creating a foundation for more advanced states of meditation.
Right. Okay. Well, geez, I'm so glad I'm getting all these answers. So another question then would be related to a long time ago, I wrote to you asking about eating onions and garlic. and the reason I wrote to you, the reason I wrote to you was because every time I would eat onions and garlic, I would experience, I think it's called hypnagogic paralysis.
Oh my goodness.
And I had a dream one time, because it would happen every time I would eat, like, say, an Indian meal for lunch.
Yeah.
And since I worked for myself, I would sometimes take a nap after lunch, and I would wake up. My mind would be awake, but my body would be paralyzed.
Yeah.
And I had this dream one time, because it was very disconcerting, that I was standing right beside Mr. Davis, and he's much taller than me. So I asked him, "What do I do?" And in the dream, he looked down at me and he said, "You know what to do." And then I knew what I had to do was to chant Om at the frontal regions of the brain, the spiritual eye center. Mm-hmm. And I popped right out of it. And now, anytime that happens, I bring my awareness to the frontal regions of the brain when this occurs, and I wake right up. Yeah. So my first question is, what is it about onions and garlic that might cause this, if there is anything? And if so, what are your thoughts on why bringing awareness to the frontal regions of the brain would allow it to end so quickly?
Okay. Well, onions and garlic, in Ayurveda are a little tamasic. Mm-hmm. They also happen to be high sulfur content.
Okay.
And particular methionine, which is an amino acid. And, people who tend towards sleep paralysis and night terrors and other sleep disorders can have a little chemistry that is off a little bit, so they can react to certain amino acids and certain foods that way.
Okay.
You just have to be careful about that, because that's what yoga nidra is: sleep, mind awake, body asleep, and as you say, it can be quite scary.
Right.
because you're paralyzed for all intents and purposes. So you just have to be careful with that. But it also can indicate the ability to go deep in meditation, or at least the proclivity to. But it is a deeper way. If you were to say higher and deeper parts of the brain, that's sort of like your brain stem is still aware and conscious while your cortex is sound asleep. And that's the reason, because the cortex has the sensory motor strips in it. So the sensory motor strips enable you to use your senses for input, and then you use your motor ability for output. So all of the motor output functions of the body. Well, when you're in that state, guess what? That part of your brain is paralyzed. But the part of your brain where you have some conscious awareness is watching the whole thing. So there's a disconnection that happens there. I don't know if you, Swami Kriyananda, in one of his books, I can't remember which, he mentions that he went through that stage very consciously for a long time. He had to figure out how to use his legs, how to walk, like everything was disconnected.
Right.
But when you hit that state, as you discovered, to come out of that state is an activation. Guess where the main place to activate your brain is in the frontal lobes. So putting your attention there in the prefrontal lobes, or even the higher brain, is sort of self-directed neuroplasticity. You're telling that area of the brain to wake up the cortex, so that I can move away from this paralysis. And it can be considered an activation issue. Sometimes we will see this problem with children or adults who have attention deficit disorder. So it's really an activation problem. The brain is having some difficulty activating certain areas or maintaining activation as it should be. So, but with you anyway, you obviously intuitively figured out how to get through that. So that's good.
Well, it is useful. I mean, once I got the hang of it, like you were describing, you can stay there and practice yoga nidra as you're describing. Yeah. I guess I was thinking that then this is not the reason that most people shouldn't eat onions and garlic on the meditative path, because I thought that was the reason. I thought it affected everybody that way.
That's probably individual to you.
Okay. Interesting. Yeah. Well, does onions and garlic tend to make other individuals sleepy as well? Because that's one of the other things that I've personally experienced. I can't really meditate. It's like it's hard.
They're a little tamasic, but you may want to. This has to do with some of the sulfur-based amino acids.
Okay.
I'll never forget one time. Roy encouraged me to go down to the Conyers Monastery. It's a beautiful Benedictine monastery in South Georgia, mid to South Georgia. And I went down there and I initiated a few of the monks into Kriya Yoga. It was a lot of fun. And one day, one of them asked me some dietary recommendations, and they were vegetarian, of course. And I didn't mention onions and garlic, but I did mention ginseng. That was definitely the wrong recommendation. It absolutely was a rajasic.
Right.
So these foods can have very strong effects, and there's many yogis who say don't eat onions and garlic because they do tend to have this tamasic feature.
Right. Okay. Well, I know that you're a very busy individual, and our time is running short here, so I only have a few more questions for you. Number one, with the Kriya Yoga practice, oftentimes there is this recommendation to learn how to see this inner light when you're meditating with your eyes closed, and to also hear, what's called the Om vibration, or the pranava. And in my experience, it happened almost by accident, in that I recognized that, number one, my body needs to be as relaxed as possible, yet I also internally have to be as internally alert as possible. Mm-hmm. So when it comes to what you understand about how the nervous system and brain works, what kind of general advice would you give to people to be able to, again, let their body be as relaxed as possible, yet also remain as alert as possible without falling asleep?
Well, posture obviously is one of the most important factors. I usually encourage people not to sit on the floor when they first start to meditate, but to sit up straight in the chair with their soles of their feet flat on the floor.
Okay.
And if they can, without hurting their back, move their back away from the back of the chair. Again, different people are going to have, some people can't fall asleep if they try, but like say other people, boom, they go right out.
Right.
So posture is very important, and then where you have your eyes, where your focus is, and so on, all important things. And generally, if I'm teaching light and sound meditation, the darker the room, the better. Sometimes we'll even use eye masks, sometimes even earplugs. Anything that really blocks out external, stimulation helps us to, obviously helps us to internalize and experience what's going on inside.
Right. And when it comes to being able to see that light or hear that sound, have you been able to record anything on your devices about what's going on in the brain when that's happening?
No, not yet. And I haven't looked, to be honest with you. But, if it's really occurring in the visual cortex, which is in the back of the brain,
Right.
you might see something. I don't know. It's hard. I would need very, very expensive equipment to do some of that.
Gotcha. I understand. Okay. And then my final question would be, since you've had a lot of experience, both with the science of it and also the art and the practice of it, and a lifetime of commitment to Kriya Yoga and this study, what advice would you give to meditators to keep their practice fresh, to keep their practice alive, so that they're able to really go deep for the duration of the time that they have?
Well, it really comes down to the commitment and to the the intensity of the individual. There's no other way that I know of other than and this is the problem. I know you've run into this too, Ryan. Oh, I've tried to meditate, I just can't do it.
Right.
Well, as Roy would say, just do it. So it's making that time commitment on a daily basis to do our spiritual studies, and then whether or not our mind is cooperating, just sit there for the allotted amount of time, because eventually everyone learns that the mind will calm and quiet down. You just have to do it. There's no secret to getting there. So I think it's just fairly simple, really.
Okay, so just essentially stay in the course.
Stay the course.
Excellent, great. All right, Marty. Well, I really appreciate you taking the time to do this, and it's just been wonderful talking to you. So thank you.
Yeah, my pleasure, Ryan, and I hope to see you soon.
Yeah, you be well. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, bye.
This episode of the Kriya Yoga podcast was made possible by donations from Kriya Yoga apprenticeship students and supporters of our Patreon community at www.patreon.com/Kriya Yoga.